When Charles Darby was discovered dead in his family home, his wife Linda was immediately considered to be the prime suspect. Not only was she arrested, but to her shock, she was convicted of his murder. Linda did not want to serve time for a crime she still to this day swears that she did not commit. And after 2 years in prison, she managed to escape. This is the puzzling case of Linda Darby and the murder of her husband. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me today. I will say today's case has perplexed me a little bit. I will be really interested to know your thoughts. Maybe you will believe that the wheels of justice turned appropriately. Maybe you won't. As ever, let me know your thoughts. I am wearing my favourite Do Not Comply hoodie. It's my camo edition. If you want to get your hands on one of these, you can follow the link below. Also, at the moment, I am advertising the fact that my book, The Serial Killer Next Door, is going to get released in September. I'll be recording it for the audiobook in July, and you'll be able to get your hands on a copy if you follow the link below. Right, let's get on with today's case. In the late 1960s, Linda and Charles Darby were married. Now, Charles was actually Linda's second husband. She already had 4 children from her previous marriage. And ideally, it would mean that this marriage was going to work out and they would be happy. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. Linda and Charles did go on to have one other child together. And that meant that Linda was now a mother of 5. And I would say that the people who knew Linda said that she was a good mother. She was somebody who seemed quite devoted to her children in those days. But equally, there were some odd behaviours that are difficult to ignore that I'll explain shortly. Now, in 1969, Linda and Charles start to experience some pretty awful things with respect. They get this campaign of harassment against them. So things like the fence getting set on fire occur, their cars vandalised, they get stolen, their home is literally burned down. And Linda, when this is all playing out, theorises that they're experiencing this trouble because Charles wasn't in the local union. He actually worked as a subcontractor specialising in installing aluminium siding on buildings. And whilst a lot of people will say, well, why on earth would that result in somebody having their home burnt down? But I don't know about your age frames, but I can certainly talk about mine. When I was a really young child, we had the miners' strikes in the UK. And wow, did things get a little bit on the spicy side. You really didn't want to be somebody who decided to carry on working whilst the strikes were on. If you did, well, you did receive a whole heap of abuse. And some people will agree with that because they'll see you as not siding with the people who are fighting for your rights. Some people will not agree with that because they'll see you going to work as being necessary to feed your children. Wherever you are on the fence, it really doesn't matter. The point is, like I said, when you are not in a union and when you are in a union can cause big issues regarding the way that people view you. And like I said, things certainly can get spicy in these situations. So Linda theorising this isn't totally left field. It would make sense that he would incur certain issues if he was not literally towing the party line. So because they're going through all of these things, they feel like the best thing to do for the safety of the family is to move away. And new starts can always be really beneficial. And certainly if you think that your life is at risk, and let's put that into context. If somebody burns down your home, that is a whole world away from vandalising your car. It is a threat directly on your life. And if you don't know who's doing it, then the wolf is always at the door. So moving away certainly would feel like a beneficial scenario for the entire family, for your safety, and also just for your mental health. So they move to Beach Street. That's a neighbourhood in Hammond, Indiana. And the premise of this is for a new start. Doesn't work out though, because Linda, shall we say, has started to get a bit of an issue with spending. She likes to spend a lot of money. And when you're spending a lot of money, that's cool if you happen to be able to write the checks and meet those check sums. But if you haven't got the money, you're going to accrue a lot of debt. And that's exactly what she does. Charles finds out and he's really upset about this. He confronts her, but she says to him, okay, I have spent the money, but I've spent the money because I need to be treated for cancer because I haven't got health insurance with you So what do you want me to do? To die? And Charles, in that moment, is going to be on the back foot. If his wife's got cancer and basically needs to be treated, then who is he to say no to that? Of course, the problem is Linda doesn't have cancer. She's perfectly well. And she's just simply enjoying overspending the money that they don't have on very expensive things. Now, personally, when somebody does something like that, it's a massive red flag. The average human being will not lie about such enormous things. The reason that you would not betray the people that you love in such a heinous way is because if you say you've got cancer, you're going to psychologically and emotionally destroy them on a range of levels. You've got 5 children. They're looking at you. They want you to be present. They love you. And now they think they've got a mother who's dying potentially of cancer. The husband, in this case, can't challenge her because he's got a sick wife, even though it's getting them in debt. And he's believing that he has to help her out because of the fact that clearly if he loves her, he's going to want her to survive. And then ultimately to find out that she's just made it up because she enjoys frittering money away, it genuinely is going to destroy your sense of security in your relationship. And also you're going to look at that human being and think, what is it about you that can cultivate such a fantasy? And some people will look in and say, well, because people get themselves into a state. A lie becomes a bigger lie, becomes a bigger lie, and in the end, you're so bought in that you have nowhere else to go. But like I said, on a personality level, this kind of grand scheme conning, it speaks usually to a particular type of personality, and it isn't a positive personality. Now, in response to this, because Charles is absolutely blown away by the fact that his wife hasn't just lied and betrayed him, but has also spent his money, he thinks, well, you know what, I'm going to teach her a lesson. So he goes to the local paper and he literally prints an ad which read that he wasn't responsible for Linda's debts. He was only responsible for his own. And understandably, Linda was infuriated and humiliated by this. Was Charles right doing that? Absolutely not. Genuinely, when somebody has hurt you, when somebody has betrayed you, you have the upper ground morally. Don't destroy that by going and doing something that's going to reputationally damage your family because there are children involved. They both act diabolically in this situation. Neither is showing themselves to be a good person in that moment. And some people will say, well, Charles had a right to retaliate. No. Charles is a father. If you have children, you draw back from such dreadful behaviour. Linda, on the other hand, had acted in that way. She did deserve judgment, but maybe that judgment would have been better coming from legal services, for example. Maybe consequences would have been more effective through a legal challenge. We get to New Year's Eve 1969, and at this point, another bizarre thing occurs. So an individual, anonymously of course, informs the local paper that Linda and Charles Darby had died in a car accident. They literally had the obituaries printed. This speaks potentially of further harassment. Was it that someone was trying to play another cruel trick? Those people who had harassed them previously at their former address had found them and thought that this would be funny to do, or would make them once again feel uneasy in their new surroundings. And it was never found out who actually made the call with the false information. It is quite mind-blowing how often those things happen. I mean, how often have you opened your social media and some celebrities apparently dead and they're not dead at all, but just some strange oddball in the world has thought, I'm just gonna say that Matt Dillon's dead today and hope it catches on. And people just spread it like wildfire because nobody actually thinks to check whether that's actually true or otherwise. In fact, these days, if ever I see that it's being put in the press that a celebrity is dead, I always check out whether it's just some kind of lie because it happens too often to not do so. Now, on the first weekend of March 1970, Linda decides that she's going to take her children on a trip to Ashland in Kentucky because she wants to go and visit her father, which is a completely normal trip. We would expect her to have contact with her father, and it would make sense that she'd take the children to see the granddad. Charles wasn't feeling well at the time, so he decided that he wasn't actually going to travel with them. Because of this, he'd rather stay at home. And also, I think we can all agree their relationship is not going to have been in the best state, is it? If you're in a scenario where your wife has been lying to you about the fact that she's got cancer, she's also got you into debt over your eyeballs, and on top of that, you're in a situation where you felt so aggrieved you've gone to the local papers and just humiliated her, it's probably likely that going on trips together isn't your priority. Now, on the way back from that trip on March the 3rd, 1970, Linda ends up going to stay at a hotel. She stays at a Holiday Inn in Valparaiso with her children. Now, she had actually travelled most of the way back from visiting her family, so she'd almost got back to her own locality. But apparently she'd become really tired as the journey was almost 7 hours long. So she'd stopped at this hotel because she just wanted a break from driving, put her head down, go to sleep, wake up in the morning, allegedly fresh as a daisy, so to speak. But she did actually ask staff for a 10 p.m. wake-up call. It's not clear why. I would say it is quite unusual to want somebody to wake up at 10 p.m, but there must have been a reason as far as Linda was concerned, and I'm sure the prosecution are going to use that reason very effectively. Now we get to March the 4th, 1970. This is around midnight, and unfortunately there is a fire at Linda and Charles's home. Now bear in mind, they've been through this before. Their home was burnt to the ground on a previous occasion, so this seems like real bad luck. And apparently on this occasion there'd been an explosion. So firefighters are called to attend, and they get there very quickly. They put the fire out, and immediately they can smell gasoline. So they can recognise automatically when they arrive that gasoline's been used as an accelerant. The whole house literally reeked of it. And the firefighters initially think that the house is empty. But once they manage to get the fire under control, they realise that that isn't the case. And they find the body of Charles Darby lay on a mattress. However, it was evident immediately that the smoke and the flames hadn't been the cause of death. So what would initially have been an investigation into the cause of the fire quickly turns into a murder investigation because Charles Darby had been shot in the heart. Now, I know that some of you may have heard about this case and heard about Charles Darby being killed in different ways, saying that he was shot in the abdomen or in the side, but a Darby versus State court document reports he was shot in the heart. Immediately, Linda is considered to be a suspect in the murder of her husband. We understand when somebody is killed unexpectedly and without an apparent motive, usually the partner will be looked at, because this doesn't sound like a robbery gone wrong. This doesn't sound like an accidental scenario unfolding. It certainly doesn't sound like a suicide, because you don't shoot yourself in the heart. But arguably, Linda wasn't present. So even though she's absolutely in the line of fire, she wasn't meant to be at home. She was meant to be at that hotel. But when they start looking at that, bear in mind, she'd been less than an hour's drive away from home. She had been expected back at Charles's house that night, but she still chose to stay in a hotel. Wouldn't it have made more sense to complete the journey home? However, equally, we can all agree, traveling with 5 children probably isn't a great deal of fun, particularly when they're absolutely knackered. I mean, tired children, and this is genuinely taken from a piece of research, when they are overtired, it's like having drank 4 pints of beer and also being hyperactive at the same point. We'll all have known what that felt like as children, and we'll certainly know if we've got kids. So you end up with these hyperactive, drunk things running around, screaming and getting completely beside themselves. And when you're driving in a car, it's not the easiest of things. So I do have some sympathy and empathy with her if she says, I've had it, I want to stop, I want to go to a hotel, I want to get my head down. She's probably not that bothered about getting home to Charles Darby because their relationship, let's be honest, isn't going to be in the best of places and spaces. She probably would be willing to just pack it in for the day, go to sleep and deal with tomorrow as it arrives. And that's exactly what she's going to say. That's the reasoning behind why she went to that hotel, that they'd all had enough and she called it a day. But the police question this, and they question, of course, the people who were with her as well, which are her children. And one of her daughters actually informed them that Linda had left the hotel for some time on the night of the fire. She didn't know where her mother had gone. She wasn't entirely sure of the time frames, but she did know one thing. She knew that her mother had told her not to tell anyone that she was leaving the hotel room and to tell anyone who asked that she had been in the room all night. Now, that seems deeply suspicious, doesn't it? Because why would you tell your child to give you an alibi unless you're going to go and do something wrong? I suppose I can play devil's advocate at this moment in time and see it from a slightly different perspective. Let's say you were a mother who knows that your job is to protect and look after your 5 children, who knows that it would be considered potentially child endangerment or neglect if you were to leave your children by themselves for any amount of time, and you know that you're going to go off somewhere and I don't know, do something that you shouldn't do, maybe gamble or hook up with somebody, do something that isn't acceptable, that your husband wouldn't be happy with, and that if anybody found out about, you would get judged very severely. So you enlist the support of your child, thinking it'll be fine, she won't tell anybody. Also, if it gets found out that I've left, she will be able to say, well, no, that wasn't true because mummy was here, and hopefully no one will be the wiser. So it could be ultimately that that's the reason why she asked the child to be on board, by saying that if anybody asks, I was here all night. And therefore it could just be this really unhappy coincidence that on the night that she's doing that, something terrible happens to her husband because, well, it is rather incriminating, isn't it? Also, things get worse for Linda because her daughter's told the police this, but now someone who actually works at the Holiday Inn where Linda and her children had stayed discovered a shotgun. And actually that shotgun that had been hidden behind a vending machine, whilst it wasn't conclusively proven to be the murder weapon, what the expert who looked at it did say was it was consistent with the weapon used to kill Charles Darby. So it couldn't actually be stated that it was the weapon, but it was a weapon that matched what you would use in that situation. And if that wasn't incriminating enough, a neighbour actually confirmed that that gun had belonged to the Darbys, as they had actually sold it to Charles themselves. So why is a gun that was sold to the Darbys hidden behind a vending machine at the motel that Linda stayed in, and the motel that Linda left after getting a wake-up call from a member of staff, and why had she told her daughter to lie about that fact? So now the police are really convinced that there is something wrong going on. Hotel staff also found that some items of clothing had been left behind in the hotel room, and these clothes were identified by a shop worker, a guy called Guy Rosen, as being worn by a woman who came into the convenience store where he worked on the night of March the 3rd. And that woman had bought 2 gallons of gas. Now, Guy had allowed the woman to take away a gas can, and she later brought it back sometime after midnight, though the gas cans were actually analysed for fingerprints, and on those gas cans there were none that were actually found. But the fact that a witness identified her as someone who bought gas that was used in the fire is pretty incriminating. And then there was another piece of evidence brought in, which were the tyre tracks of Linda's station wagon. So these get examined, and it's found that these matched the tyre tracks at the house. Is it just me that thinks that's a little bit unfair as a piece of evidence? I'm just like imagining how strong that would be if I were working on the case, you know? Hey, Len, yeah, got an amazing piece of evidence in this suspected homicide case. Yeah, go on, I like evidence. Yeah, it's pretty strong. What is it? We've only matched the tires of the potential perpetrator with the actual address that the murder occurred at. Wow, that's strong. It is strong. So, is it a stranger's car? Well, no, it's his wife's car. Does his wife live at the address? Yeah, she does. Would it not make sense that maybe the tire marks are from her previously being there? Really don't like it when you screw up my evidence, Len. Just throwing it out there. It really doesn't make sense to me that that was a piece of evidence. Of course, her tyre tracks were at the house. She lived there. It's as simple as that. It was Linda's home. Why wouldn't they be there? But I know how these things go. The prosecution want to build a strong case, and that just adds a little bit more, doesn't it, to it? Now, the autopsy revealed that though the gunshot had been Charles's cause of death, Another thing that they found that was really concerning in his blood was arsenic, the poison arsenic. So this led the investigators to theorize that he'd been being poisoned over several months. And again, that meant, as far as they were concerned, they were looking in the direction of Linda for being the perpetrator of this poisoning. So as far as the police are concerned, all of this points to Linda being the murderer, and she ends up getting arrested the day after her husband's funeral. Weirdly, she didn't actually go to Charles's funeral, and it's kind of good because if she had attended his funeral, the police would have arrested her there. They were waiting for her, but it turns out that she decided that she was going to go to Kentucky and to stay with some family there whilst this was all kicking off. Maybe it's because she felt that she was in the line of fire and the police were looking at her and that it was just a matter of time and she wanted to be with a supportive family until that occurred. Maybe it was that she just didn't want to go to the funeral, but that does make her look pretty guilty when you think about what I've told you so far, particularly if you're a grieving wife, you'd want to be present to say goodbye to your husband. But like I said, she doesn't go and she's arrested a day after that funeral occurs. Now, whilst awaiting trial, she gets put out on bond and she ends up going on holiday with her family. I do understand, no matter what scenario you're in, you're not going to change anything by staying behind closed doors and crying. But I do think it can look quite negative for you if you go on holiday when you are waiting the trial of the murder of your husband. I don't necessarily think that was a good idea because I think these things can make you look like you're not mourning, and you should be mourning the death of a loved one, and you shouldn't necessarily be off having fun with your family because people feel it's inappropriate and people judge you because of that. And if you are innocent, then one of the things that you want to do is to remember that you have to seem innocent. It's not fair. Your innocence should be enough. But people are looking at the chinks in your armour. They're looking for the fractures in those foundations of innocence. And if they see you doing things that you are enjoying, when they think that you should be in a period of grieving, that's going to make them question you, even if that questioning is unfair in reality. Now, from the get-go of Linda's arrest, she protests her innocence. She says, there is absolutely no way I'm responsible for my husband's killing. I am completely innocent of these charges. And she says that throughout and onwards. When it comes down to the court case, Linda's defence argued that there was a lack of physical evidence against her. They had planned to call character witnesses, but instead they basically rested their case without calling a single witness. They basically said the evidence fell short of putting Mrs. Darby in Hammond on March the 3rd. So the defence basically relied upon the fact that it's up to the prosecution to provide the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and they genuinely apparently didn't feel that the prosecution had done that because no fingerprints had been found on the gas canister. Her clothing was supposed to be tested for the presence of gasoline, but the results of this were never revealed, or the testing was never actually carried out. So they basically believed that the prosecution had a weak case. Now, the state, I would say, disagreed. I think they believed that they had a very strong case. So they present the evidence in the case and they present the salesman opinion that the tyre tracks belonged to Linda. They brought in Linda's own child who testified against her, which is pretty damning. So the child insisted that her mother left the hotel that night and then threatened her to not tell anyone. Also the shotgun, like literally the gun, that's going to be pretty incriminating, that was found at the hotel. And that was presented with an expert witness stating that it was consistent with the murder weapon. The gas station attendants who literally identified Linda. Now, they weren't actually allowed to physically testify because it was determined that the police had tainted the identification process by showing them a picture of Linda prior to the lineup. But if you're a jury and what I've just told you is the prosecution is brought in, and bear in mind the defence haven't called any witnesses, they've just basically said, well, you've got to prove that she wasn't at that hotel at the time that you say she was. And then they come in and they're like, well, we've got this witness. Oh, and we've got this daughter who said that she definitely left. Oh, and by the way, we've got a gun that was definitely sold to her and her husband and is consistent with the murder weapon. Oh, and we've got these clothes that might not have been tested that probably had gasoline on them. And yeah, the cans didn't actually have fingerprints on, but the guy saw her and she could have wiped the fingerprints off. If you are brought that as a prosecution, then the prosecution's strong as far as a jury is concerned. They just need to think, is there reasonable doubt? And what I've just outlined would make people question that there was. So on the 24th of September 1970, she's found guilty of the murder of her husband. And again, I've been through the court documents and I'm not surprised. And then we get to October the 1st, 1970, Linda is sentenced to life in prison. She was actually told that she'd be eligible for parole after 15 years. She'd later actually say, I am not a murderer and I just don't know how they ever convicted me of murder. Now, the story doesn't end here, because on March the 13th, 1972, Linda escapes. She literally escapes. So she climbs over a 10-foot barbed wire fence at the Indiana Women's Prison. She got really badly scratched up. She got really bloody in the process. And apparently she looked really beaten up because she seemed to have been in a scenario where something terrible had happened to her. And people didn't believe she was an escape from prison. They just thought that she'd had a really bad experience. So she uses the way that she looks to ask strangers for help, saying that she's been beaten up by a boyfriend. And at one of the homes where she's helped, she meets a man called Willie McElroy Jr., who members of his family call Junior. And she literally falls for him and he falls for her. And he ends up bringing her back to Pulaski, a city about 75 miles south of Nashville. This is where he'd grown up. And then she takes his name and calls him a husband and basically carries on with her life. Now, even though she calls him her husband, it's a common law situation because Pulaski authorities said they've never been able to find any evidence that the couple actually married on a legal basis. She then takes up jobs such as babysitting, cleaning, doing whatever she needs to do to make money. And she actually goes on to have another 2 children with Willie, who is her 3rd husband. And she even became a grandmother to 8 grandchildren. And the pair end up running a second-hand store between them as well. So she's working hard, she's becoming part of the community. Now, at some point, according to some resources, they say that she did split up with Junior, as in they weren't physically connected on a marital level common law basis anymore. Other sources say that they remain married, but nonetheless, whatever, they remained in a very nice relationship, whether that's as friends or still in some kind of intimate way. They certainly had no bad blood between them. They were great friends. They remained close, whatever the scenario, and they continued to work together. So that is evident that they were still very connected. She was involved in the community and lots of people thought she was amazing. She got on with getting to know lots of people in her home environment. She volunteered at her grandchildren's school. And she managed to avoid detection by changing her name and also by changing 1 digit of her social security number. Linda claimed that one of the main reasons she believes that she failed to be apprehended was because she never actually told anybody about her past life. She didn't tell anybody that she'd been arrested for murder. She made absolutely no contact with her previous 5 children, and she just didn't tell anyone of her life before. So she just cut it off. Now, that seems like a very difficult thing to do. Arguably, what we know about this woman is that she can lie quite well because she lied about having cancer to her prior husband. Could it be, therefore, that she just invented a whole past that never existed? She's somebody who's quite happy and capable of lying, and therefore that's what she could have done. She was quite convincing. Another motivator for not actually telling people around her who she once was is that would have been risky for them. It could have meant that if she'd been caught, they would have basically been a co-conspirator, or at least they'd have averted the course of justice by not telling people. And she knew that that would implicate people, and she said it would put them in the middle of it too. She didn't want to burden people with that information, so she didn't confide in anyone. Although, not being funny, Linda, if you had confided that information, you might have put people in the middle of it. You might also have found that you lost your freedom. Because I don't know, if you've been like, you know what, I've got this really funny story. Have you got a funny story? I like funny stories, Linda. Well, I mean, I say it's funny. I'm wondering now whether the word funny is appropriate, but it's a bit left field. Oh, has it got some twists and turns, this story, Linda? It's got some twists and turns, yeah. All right, okay. It's also got a dead body. What? Yeah, it's got a dead body. really sure whether this story is something I want to hear. Well, I feel like I've invested now, so I probably should. I once got charged and convicted of murder of my husband, and then I escaped prison and I'm on the run. But now I'm working in the shop selling second-hand things, and you're here buying a plate. So I just thought I'd have that conversation. Oh, where are you leaving? Why are you going? Is she calling somebody? Anyway, I'm just saying, it's another reason, isn't it? You wouldn't confide to anyone else. You don't want them to tell the authorities because, you know, we make friends, we break friends. We get into relationships, they break down. And that person has the information on us. And sometimes we don't like that person having the information on us. But to all intents and purposes, she says nobody knew. And one of the things that she said she struggled with was the fact that she didn't contact her children from her previous relationships, because she said that she was always tempted to do that because obviously she missed them. But because she manages to keep this secret so well, because she manages to live a really quiet and also non-criminal life, she's literally undetected by authorities for decades. And she said that she used to manage psychologically by just asking God to please let her be able to raise her children. And even though she found that life on the run from the authorities was really nerve-wracking, particularly at first, she said that she often cried herself to sleep. She said that over the years, obviously, she got more confident because essentially they didn't come for her. But just like any roll of luck, most times it will come to an end. And for her, that's exactly what plays out, because she ends up getting discovered by the authorities. And don't get me wrong, she's been free for a long time, but the inevitable occurs. And on the 19th of October 2007, she's taken back into custody. She's aged 64, so that's 35 years after she'd escaped. And the reason that she gets caught is there's been this new fugitive task force that had been formed in Indiana, and they managed to track her to Tennessee. Now, though she didn't have a criminal record in a new life, she had acted as a witness in an assault. So she'd actually gone in and helped another person by being a witness, and that is what introduced them back into her world. The authorities track her down because of this. Now, in an interview, she said that one day there was a knock at her door while she was fixing dinner, and her daughter went and answered that door. She'd done the cleaning for the day, she'd been out working, and it was a police officer who she'd known for years who showed her an old photo of herself, asked her if she knew who that person was. And she said, rather than deny it, she said, that's me. I could sit here all day and lie to you, but fingerprints don't lie. The police officer was blown away. He'd known Linda for 30 years in a new life and in a new identity, and he'd actually said to her at the moment that she confessed that it was her, he said, I told them that they got it wrong. He really didn't think it was Linda. The woman he knew was never going to be capable of killing her husband. And the community where Linda was living was absolutely stunned. Stunned. They loved her. She was this unassuming grandma. She was a big part of the community. She was a good person. They couldn't wrap their head around that one of their own could have done anything so heinous. And one of Linda's neighbours, Mrs. Slater, said that they were flabbergasted because they just didn't believe that she'd done that she didn't seem like that type of person whatsoever. Another neighbour, 85-year-old Ms. Gordon, said that Linda would call and check on her and was just really nice and really kind. She said, we really love her, and I really hate this. Then Linda's friend, Ms. Gilbert, said that when Linda arrived in Pulaski, she just fell into place. She was just family. She said that Linda's departure felt like now part of the family's been taken away. And the police captain of Pulaski, John Dickey, said that he was really surprised. He said, I've known her the last 16 years. She's lived the life of a real good citizen. I suppose the people who were most surprised, however, were Linda's family, her husband, whether they were together or otherwise, her children and her grandchildren, who Linda maintains never knew anything about her criminal past. And after her capture, Linda says she told her common-law husband and children about her past. She said, they support me, they believe in my innocence, and to be fair, many people in Pulaski, Tennessee also believe in her innocence because for more than 30 years, she was flawless in life. That's the quote. It said, she never got into any trouble. She led a flawless life. However, the family of Charles Darby, they absolutely disagree with those sentiments. They're really relieved that Linda Darby is in prison. They said, "We are Christians. We don't believe in revenge, but I am glad that they caught her. I just hope they don't let her go again." That was Alice Robinette, who was Charles's sister. And then his niece said she needs to pay for her crime. She got to live. He didn't. And they're fair sentiments. I think I'd feel exactly the same if somebody I loved had been murdered and the assumed murderer had managed to escape and evade justice for over 3 decades. You'd be thrilled they were back in prison. Now, Linda said that during her period of being free, she did consider turning herself in, but she said she didn't want to go back to something and pay for anybody else's crime, which, again, if she's innocent, would make perfect sense. Arguably, she did get 3.5 decades free when she should have been in prison. And it's interesting when you think about it in this way, because if she'd served her time, she could actually have been out on parole after 15 years. And she'd already served 2 of those years before she escaped, so it would have been 13 years that she would have served. But it's likely that she will now die behind bars. She's unhappy about this. Because like I said, from the get-go, Linda said she's innocent, and she still says that today. So on the 28th of June 2019, there was actually a hearing as Linda had filed for a post-conviction relief. So the reason for this is she said that her counsel performed deficiently when it happened at the original trial. They said that they failed to obtain a police statement, they failed to thoroughly investigate potential witnesses, they failed to develop additional testimony in regard to the telephone calls at the Holiday Inn, they failed to present evidence of the intensity of a shotgun blast, they failed to present evidence of suspicious marks on Charles' body, that they failed to present evidence that the prosecution had requested that the Indiana State Police conduct an examination of clothing for the presence of gasoline, that they failed to present evidence of soil comparisons, and that they failed to present evidence of a prior fire, and that they failed to object to the prosecution's comments during rebuttal, and that they failed to obtain redaction of an instruction reciting the grand jury indictment of her. So they failed to do quite a lot of things, is what she's saying. I've just given you that list because they are the issues that she had with her counsel. She said basically they were completely ineffective during my trial in 1970. And she even went on to say, look, I would have loved to have testified at my trial. I actually asked one of my attorneys whether I needed to testify, and I was told no. So she was advised to not present at her own trial. Both of those attorneys had died since their original trial, which is obviously a problem because no one can go and ask them why or if all of that's true. But she feels that she was let down. Linda also argued that if Charles had been shot at home, the neighbours would have heard. And the reason for that is she said, look, the distance in 1970 between my home and the next door residence had only been 9 feet and 5 inches. Somebody would have heard the gunshot. She also submitted an affidavit from a skilled witness who suggested that the police investigation of the fingerprints had been inadequate, and had Charles actually been shot while lying in his bed at home as opposed to another location, the shotgun blast would have been heard by neighbours. And Linda also argued that she'd never known that her decision to testify in her own defence was hers to make. So she said that she'd inquired of one of her trial attorneys, don't I need to testify? And he replied, no. And like I said, she said, well, I would have wanted to testify at trial. So she then sought to provide the omitted testimony at the post-conviction hearing. Now, the post-conviction court didn't allow it. They didn't allow it to be included, but they did permit her to submit a post-hearing written offer of proof. But I do understand from what I've just listed why Linda Darby was probably unhappy with the initial case. So she obviously had quite a few qualms about this, the fact that the fingerprints hadn't been investigated properly, the fact that there was no report on the clothes that were apparently sent off for gasoline, the fact that an expert came in and said, look, if you'd been shot there, the neighbour would have heard, and the fact that she'd never actually been given an opportunity to testify against what was being said about her. But in spite of all of that, she was denied the post-conviction relief. It was determined that she hadn't been denied effective trial counsel. You may agree with that, you may not agree with that. I do think that she had some really fair points there. You know, you're dealing with somebody murder and that's really important, but that means you want to definitely get the person who's the perpetrator in this case. Whilst initially when I started to look at this, it felt very open and closed, that she was just the absolute guilty party and without a shadow of a doubt, she was the murderer. When you start to look at the case itself and the fact that the defense case was pretty poor and the prosecution case was pretty circumstantial, there is, I suppose, a sliver of possibility that Linda Darby didn't actually kill Charles. Now, she remains in prison. She is still claiming her innocence. And her message to people who knew her as Linda McElroy is this: this is who I am. I am not a murderer. I didn't do it. She said that she would like to know who murdered Charles and also that she would like to escape prison again, but this time legally, leaving by walking through the front door. Now, whilst a lot of things in this case may seem unclear, one thing still remains clear, and that is that Charles Darby was the victim in this case. He was 25 years of age when he died. He was a father of an infant son when he was viciously murdered. Bear in mind, he was a Navy veteran. He served upon the USS Enterprise during the Vietnam era, and he was somebody that clearly deserved respect, and he didn't get that at the end of his life. That noted, even though he is the victim, it is possible to some degree that Linda Darby could be a victim too. Maybe a victim of circumstance, an individual who had this crime pitted against her when really it was people who were out to get the both of them and managed to do so in such an enormous way. Now, as I come to the conclusion of this case, I would say it isn't overly obvious to me whether Linda is guilty or otherwise, and that would suggest reasonable doubt. What I do have fears about is the fact that both her and Charles were victims of harassment before moving to Hammond. I understand that what the police said was it was all her, that Linda had basically been creating all of these harassing scenarios, including the house burning down and them having to relocate and the obituaries being put in the papers. Basically, they said that she was the likely person doing that. And that was just a disguise because what she wanted to do is to create a reason for him to be murdered because she'd had enough of him and she wanted to be able to spend money without him questioning her. And this was the reasoning and motivation behind the arsenic poisoning. And therefore, you can have no sympathy with this woman because this wasn't just about a single murder. This was about a protracted attack on a man who was innocent and who believed that she was also a victim of the harassment that he was enduring, when in fact, she was the orchestrator of it. But that is all just the assumptions of the police. There's no evidence to say that was the truth. It could indeed be that they had been harassed. It could indeed be that they had been basically chased out of their initial home, which was burnt down, and that's why they'd moved to Hammond. Bear in mind, those things had happened to their home, those things had happened to their car, and they had had a really awful time. But like I said, she could have been responsible for that. But it did seem to affect her quite negatively as well as Charles. It's not like she was enjoying these situations playing out, so that's a counter to the argument. And it is unclear what her motive for killing Charles would have been. He was really unhappy with the spending, but would killing him have helped her? Would it have helped their debt? It's unlikely, in fact. Yes, she was very embarrassed by him writing about the debt in the local paper, but was this reason enough to want him dead? And actually, wouldn't that mean that the police would be looking directly at her? I mean, come on. If you've got a scenario where your marriage is in a problem situation and then your partner ends up dead after they've taken out a big piece in the local paper about you, well, people are certainly going to be looking at you immediately as the potential suspects. Now, I will note the actions and her whereabouts on the day of Charles's death were suspicious. I genuinely believe that. I'm struggling to figure out why she had the wake-up call. I'm struggling to figure out why she told a child to lie for her. I'm struggling with that. Is it that she has just had this horrific coincidental situation unfold where she was doing something that was maybe a bit naughty that she didn't want people to know about, so she made her child lie, and ultimately that led to her seeming very devious and deceptive and also being the likely candidate for killing her husband? Could it be that she was going to kill her husband? It's one of those scenarios that we cannot answer. What we do know is that from the moment that she escaped prison, wow, she lived as an upstanding citizen, and many people who know her say there is no way the woman that we know could ever have been an individual who killed anybody. She just doesn't have the personality that you would expect to be a brutal killer, to be a protracted killer who'd poisoned her husband for a long time and who ultimately shot him through the heart and set the house on fire to disguise the scene. But then we all know manipulative killers know how to lie. People who have done horrendous things can go on to live lives under the radar, seemingly perfect. Think about the individuals in the Holocaust, the Nazis who escaped. They'd done the most treacherous and heinous things to human beings, and they hid under masks of acceptability for decades. They walked amongst us, knowing the horrors they'd inflicted, and they did it as good citizens. It is possible for a leopard to mask their spots. I'm not saying that's the case where Linda Darby is concerned. And it's worth knowing that her family genuinely don't believe that she was capable of either. Her common law husband, her kids, they fully support her. They believe that she's innocent. But like I said, it's a tale of two people potentially. The Linda before the killing and the Linda after the killing. I'd love to know your thoughts on this one. I haven't got an answer for you. I'm just telling you the story. And I'm trying to look at all the different angles to give you a rounded visual on this. Because even though the prosecution's case seems tight, when you start to unpick it, you realize it's just a very convincing story wove together, not necessarily based on that many facts. And when you look at the defense, gaping holes beyond belief. Genuinely. I don't think she got effective counsel. Would that have made a difference? Maybe not, who knows? Let me know your thoughts as ever in the comments below. If you know any other snippets of this case, please let me know because it still intrigues me. I just don't know. I just don't know. See you again next time, guys. Look after yourselves, be safe.